Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining the webinar this morning with Charles Jennings from the 70-20-10 Institute. First, a couple of logistics. If you'd like to ask some questions, please feel free to use the question option in the GoToWebinar dialog box and just type in your questions. And near the end of the webinar, I'll start to select some of the questions and read them out so that Charles can answer them for us. So I would like to thank all of you for your time, and I'd like to thank Charles Jennings for his time. Charles Jennings has been a colleague for many years, and he's also, of course, an author of a Coaching Ourselves module titled Developing Your People, the 70-20-10 Framework. And we're very happy and very proud to be able to have Charles with us today. So Charles, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Phil.
So I'd like to start with why are learning and development professionals looking at doing things differently?
First of all, just welcome to everyone who's joined this morning or this afternoon, my time. Phil, I think the why question is a really important one because the world's changed dramatically, we all know, over the last 20 years and is continuing to change dramatically. And the new work environment is very, very different to the work environment that many of us started our careers in, where many of the systems and processes for learning and development were designed because they were basically structured around industrial models. It was around getting consistency. It works fine still for getting people onboarded. If you want to get people who are new to an organization, new to a role, that's fine, we can use these systems. But we're working under a whole new range of constraints to a certain extent and opportunities as well. So we've got obviously increasing complexity, more decision making. Decision making has moved down the organization. A study was done recently, when I say recently, just a few years ago, to show that in the US, for example, the number of transactional jobs that are being created is basically zero, whereas the number of jobs that require decision making, dealing with ambiguity, all those sorts of things is expanding. And even those jobs that 20 years ago were transactional, i.e. I went to work and I followed the rules, now require decision making and dealing with complex situations and so on and so forth. There's also the need for increasing speed and agility. We all know that no one goes in and does the same role for which they need that training, for the rest of their careers. Obviously, it doesn't work like that anymore. So that's one of the reasons in that we've got this new work environment, and I think lots of organizations are seeing that the old models where we had our 18th century curriculum, which is where the curriculum was developed in the 18th century, it might be called learning paths now, or could be called something else, but essentially is a map that often that doesn't work if we're trying to focus on high performance. Again, it's fine if we're trying to get people to first base, to get them started, but if we're looking at supporting real high performance, we need to look beyond that structured development, those structured offerings. And we know alongside the changes in environment, also the research is telling us that we learn a lot more about how to do our jobs well whilst doing our jobs. So a lot of the learning that occurs is part of everyday work. Of course, that's not to say that the learning we do away from work is not important. Of course that's important, but it's not as important as we thought it was. It's, we used to go take people out if we had a problem in an organization, say our customer satisfaction levels were too low. We'd take people away from work, we'd put them through some customer service program and put them back into the workplace. And we're quite often surprised when not much happened, if anything happened at all. And in fact, we still do this. And Peter Bergman wrote a very interesting aggregation, a piece of work that was published in Harvard Business Review 2 or 3 years ago, where he looked at diversity training. And he analyzed more than 800 different studies of diversity training over more than 30 years and came to the view that diversity training on the whole has no impact on diverse behaviours whatsoever, and in fact sometimes has negative effect. Now there's all sorts of reasons why that happens, but that point of transferring training into change behaviour, i.e. performance improvement, is really critical. And I think lots and lots of organisations are understanding that, you know, we learn best. In fact, learning is most often most useful when it's closest to the point of use. So if we learn it within context, that's really critical. And in fact, McKinsey did a study in 2012, I think it was, and they looked at the reason why many leadership programs fail. So a huge amount, in fact they estimated that some billions is spent, billion of US dollars is spent on leadership programs, and they found that generally they were suboptimal. The results that came out of those programs wasn't what was expected, and they came up with 4 reasons as to why they were not so effective. First of all was that that they overlook context, and again it's around, you know, context. Learning in the workplace, having the same environment is really critical. The second thing that they found was that many leadership programs decouple reflection from real work. So, and again, as you know, Henry Mintzberg has been talking for years and years about the case model, the Harvard case model, where we create some sort of artificial environment, some artificial model, and hope that that's going to be transferred into real work, and often it isn't. It actually encourages the wrong behaviours in many ways, rather than looking at the real work. The third thing that McKinsey identified is underestimating mindsets, and I think for learning and HR professionals that's critical, because I see 70-20-10 effectively as a change agent as much as anything else. And it's around changing mindsets, changing the way we look at things, changing our behaviours, changing the way we approach things. So McKinsey found that was a key issue. And the last one they found was very interesting, and I'm sure that would resonate with most people on this call, and that is that many leadership programs fail to measure the right stuff. They fail to measure impact and results. Sure, you know, and as a Chief Learning Officer, I've been in a situation where my middle and senior managers have gone to a wonderful business school with great faculty, had a great experience, come back, said it was life-changing in many ways, but when we've looked further down the way, it hasn't really changed behaviour. It's been a great experience, but in terms of investment, probably not a great investment. So we've got these factors which are, I think, both the new opportunities in terms of the new work environment and the suboptimal previous solutions really that give rationale to the why, as well as there's lots of other work that's been carried out. Burson and Associates, for example, did a study where they showed that those organizations that were focused on informal learning, and particularly on social learning, learning from and with other people, were around about 300% more effective at developing capability. The Corporate Executive Board in the States has done similar sorts of studies and come out with sort of similar figures, in that those organizations that encourage and support learning as part of work are around about 3 times more, those people who undertake that are around about 3 times more effective. In fact, when I was at Reuters, the company was part of a study some years ago where we looked at managers who were effective and focused at developing their people, and those who were seen as not being effective and not so focused at developing their people. And again, when the researchers took the data and looked at it, they found that simply having a manager who supports your development as part of your workflow is likely to produce somewhere around about 25-27% performance uplift, as well as around a 40% uplift in terms of levels of engagement. So there's lots and lots of work around that shows the why for 70-20-10. So 70-20-10 has come out of that changing environment. And I think that when we look at 70-20-10, it is a really useful model. It's a useful framework. It's not a rule, it's not a recipe, it's not some sort of mantra. It's a useful model to apply to what we do as HR professionals, as learning and development professionals, in terms of how we then can support and facilitate development as a continuous process rather than simply focusing on designing, developing, delivering courses and programs and e-learning modules, because although that's part of the picture is much bigger than that.
Excellent. So maybe you could sort of elaborate on what is 70-20-10 and what isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I could obviously elaborate for a long time. I think the perception of what 70-20-10 is and isn't is there's a wide range of perceptions. First of all, if I can just say what it isn't, and I've mentioned a few, it's not a rule. We don't aim for getting this nice split of 70-20-10 in terms of learning through experience and practice and learning through other people, through social learning and so on, and learning in a structured way. It would be crazy to do that. Of course, every individual, every situation, every organization, it will vary. But so it's not a rule. If anything, it's a rule of thumb rather than a rule. It's not a mantra. It's what it is really it's an approach to encourage and support continuous development as part of the daily workflow. So it's to help this mindset change. I said earlier 70-20-10 is a change agent. It's a way in which we can think about development as part of what we do rather than, and as part of work rather than away from work. So we don't go away to learn and develop, we actually learn and develop as part of what we do every day. So first of all, it's that approach to support continuous development. It also does a couple of other things. And these to a certain extent I think are sort of artifacts of using 70-20-10, but they're really important. One is it changes our focus from learning to performance. And that is really critical. It's easy to say, but really difficult to do. Because actually, what we're in terms of, you know, I still see myself as a fundamentally a learning person, but I don't really care so much about learning, but I'm passionate about performance. So 70-20-10 allows us to sort of flip the way we've always worked, where we've spent a lot of time focusing on the detailed design of learning, whereas 70-20-10 allows us to lift up out of that and think about performance. So that's really critical in terms of that. So going from inputs to focusing on outputs. And actually, to be honest, when we talk to senior people in our organizations, what they really care about is performance. Of course, they would like to encourage a culture of continuous learning. They would like to encourage learning. They would like everyone to learn. But actually, when it comes down to the brass tacks, it's all about performance. So that's the second element, I think. And the third one, I think that 70-20-10 really does, and certainly within the Institute where we're focused, is that it moves the focus away from individuals to teams and organizations. So if you implement 70-20-10 in an effective way, you find that you're no longer just focusing on developing individuals, because none of us achieve our objectives each year as individuals. Of course, we all work with others, we rely on others to do our work. And 70-20-10 allows us to do the sort of stuff that your organization's doing, Phil, in terms of coaching ourselves. It allows and encourages and supports a framework where we learn from each other. So we get involved in peer coaching, we get involved in action learning, we get involved in all these sorts of different approaches which are extremely powerful and that don't necessarily take us away from the workplace for any great length of time in order to do. And you know, I've seen some organizations, some big global organizations. I'm working with a extremely large American bank at the moment who are doing some great work where they're moving from the concept of courses to the concept of campaigns. So again, they're starting to look at outputs. They're looking at resources as much as courses. Of course, they still have a tremendous set of programs and courses, but they're not seen as the be-all and end-all. They're actually part of supporting that overall process. So I think 70-20-10, if nothing else, is an approach to extend our focus on learning to where it happens most, which is as part of daily work. That's what it's all about. Now, that's a very high level. Obviously, underneath that, there's a lot of detail in terms of how do we do it. And as you know, I've written with a couple of colleagues in the Institute, we've written a big book about that, which is a very detailed book around how to, the tasks, the roles and tasks required in order to get this change to occur. But really, that's how I see it. And actually, there's some good evidence. I worked with a UK company that carried out some work and published a report which is freely downloadable, a company called Towards Maturity. And they published earlier on this year a report called 70 plus 20 equals plus 10 equals 100. And in that, they showed that the data that was data gathered from across, I think, around 1,600 learning people or 1,600 people in organizations and 600 learning people, they found that organizations using 70-20-10 or models that were based around 70-20-10 that might be called something else. It might be called the 3 E's, experience, exposure, education, which it quite often is, or something else. But organizations that are using this model were, first of all, 4 times more, they were responding to business change 4 times faster. Well, they were 4 times more likely to respond to business change. Let me get that correct. 4 times more likely to say that they were responding to business change. They were 3 times more likely to report an improvement in staff motivation. And they were twice as likely to report customer satisfaction increases. So simply by refocusing development into that 70 plus 20 piece, into that workplace focused area, there's some tangible results to be shown. So 70-20-10, as I say, isn't a mantra. I see it as an agent of change. There's a lot of detail under the hood in terms of how we can do it, but it's a change in mindset as much as anything else.
Excellent, thank you. And I suppose that's a sort of a good segue to the last question. How can a learning and development professional get started leveraging these ideas and the concept or the framework of 70-20-10?
Well, I think that obviously I would say that the Institute has all sorts of resources and all of that, but there's some very simple ways, and I've mentioned some of them just talking through. The first is to step out of that course mindset. Obviously the course is useful, it's a useful framework to work on, but think beyond that course mindset. Think about resources. How can you develop and provide resources to your people that help them either just before or at the point of need? And again, research shows that the learning that occurs as close to the point of use or closer to the point of use is likely to be more effective. So it might not be you creating them yourself. It might be that you're curating it and gathering it from other experts. I'm working with a big energy company, a big European energy company at the moment, that are doing great work where they're raising awareness of people, and they have everyone from working in big power units, in big power generation plants, to building offshore wind farms, to whatever. Just getting people to think about, when I have a meeting with others, let's just take 5 minutes out to talk about what we've been doing and what's been successful and what hasn't been successful. Why has it been successful? Why hasn't it been successful? What will we do next time? What have we learned from that? Just in that sort of flow of work, using that, encouraging managers, for example, to take their one-to-one meetings with their reports and just take some time out of it and ask the same sort of questions. Just, what's worked well, what hasn't, what have you learned from that, what will you do differently next time? Because I think there's 2 things that many of us working in, particularly in the knowledge industries, don't do, that when we look at high performers in other areas, they wouldn't be high performers if they didn't do it. So let me give you an example. I often talk to people in work when I'm working with clients or working with big organizations and small organizations, and we talk about reflection and practice. And the answers are very often of a common theme. Practice is difficult because I don't want to practice because if I get it wrong, I'll be in trouble, and I just need to get it right, because we work in an environment where where error is not accepted at all, which is crazy because, of course, everyone makes errors and we learn from our errors. And the second one is reflection, where people say, I don't have time to reflect. But if you look, for example, at top sports people, if you take a baseball player or a tennis player or anything, an athlete of any sort, and you look at what they do, they practice and they reflect all the time. In fact, you will not become a high performer in any field of sport unless you become really effective at learning from your mistakes, at reflecting on what went well, what didn't go well, and changing that. And equally, you don't learn if you think that a great tennis player, maybe Novak Djokovic, comes off the court from the US Open, packs away his rackets and doesn't get them out till he plays the next championships. I mean, you'd be crazy. Of course they do that. Of course that. He'll be out on the court the following morning with his coach, working all by himself, working out what went wrong, what went well, how can I build on that. And actually, we can take those sort of models and build them into our daily work in a very, very straightforward way. It's not rocket science. There's some very, very simple approaches. Even encouraging managers just to spend a few minutes with their reports. And I often ask L&D people, I ask them how many, they might be running, say, a leadership program or some functional program. I will often ask them, have you spoken to these people who are coming to your program, these delegates? How many of their managers have you spoken to? And I usually get a blank stare, to be honest. Which again, if you think about it for a minute, the person who's in the best position to ensure that what we as learning and development people do has some impact is the manager. So if we're going to be doing our 10, running our programs and not engaging with the managers of the people who are coming on our programs, I mean, we might as well, we're going to be suboptimal from the start. So simply giving managers some tools to say, look, before you send someone on one of my programs, I want you to spend 5 or 10 minutes with them just to do this. And this might be, talk about what your expectations are, talk about what their expectations are, talk about what they expect of you once you've been through this program. Then when the person's completed the program or the course or the e-learning module, just take a few minutes out with the manager again and encourage the manager to say, well, how did that go? What is your reflection on it? What do you need from me in order to make you successful in terms of implementing what you've learned? Really, really simple stuff. That's not, that's certainly not rocket science. But again, when I look at the practices of a lot of L&D departments, as I say, I've asked that question lots of times, and occasionally people say, oh yes, we do. Usually, actually, it's on leadership programs where they say, oh yes, we've interviewed the managers, we've done that. But very often, it's, well, we've sent a quick questionnaire, but we haven't actually asked them what their expectations are or told them that they need to support once people are back in the workplace. Simple stuff like that. And there's lots and lots of things that people can do in terms of the how. We have a methodology at the Institute around an inspire, implement model, which works very well. There are lots of different models and approaches, but it can be started very easily.
Thank you very much, Charles. I'd like to turn it over to anybody who's on to ask some questions. I've seen some comments from Ross, and thank you very much, Ross. And yes, definitely Ross is asking for a citation, and we'll be providing some handouts at the end of this that you'll get by email that will give you links for references and citations. So this is the opportunity if you have some questions for Charles, please type in the questions. And since there's no questions right up front, I'm going to take this chance to ask a question that I've wanted to ask you, Charles, and that's been going through my head as I've been listening to you. So let's say you're a learning and development professional in a mid-sized organization, let's say, 2,000-3,000 employees, and the organization has been growing. And in the past, you've typically only had the bandwidth and the budget to do, let's say, type of transactional learning and development activities, sending people away for courses and programs, something like that. And now the L&D team has grown to the point where you can do something a little larger, and you're looking to get started to leverage the concepts of 70-20-10 in the type of programs and interventions that you're practicing. What are some of the pitfalls that we might fall into as we're getting started in this path?
Sure. I think there are a number of things you need to look out for. One is operating within that bubble. I think one of the challenges that learning and development has in terms of changing the way that we support and develop and help people develop is by not taking along our stakeholders, our key stakeholders. So I think it's really important that we engage with our senior leaders. I certainly found it very, very helpful in my corporate work when I was a chief learning officer, of ensuring, for example, that I had a governance body of some sort who were the senior stakeholders who really understood what we were trying to do. So I think that communication, and to be honest, L&D people, well, they're not specialists in terms of communications and marketing. So if you're not specialists, get a good communication and marketing person involved. And in fact, I've seen that. I mentioned a big American bank a big global bank I've been working with. One of the first meetings I had was with their head of learning and development and their marketing, internal communications and marketing people. So I think ensuring that people understand what you're trying to do, and it's like the old saying of people don't mind change, they just don't like being changed. It's around how you communicate the rationale for doing things differently. Again, all of us have been in the situation of what I would call solutioneering, where a senior manager might have come to us and said, I've got a training problem. I need a course for our salespeople, for example. I need a training course, which of course is what I call solutioneering. And if we just say, okay, how long, how many, when, that's just giving in to solutioneering. So one of the first things we need to focus on is getting that engagement for people to understand why you're making those changes. And then when someone comes to you and says, I need a training course on X, you have a set of questions which in the roles that we've created and published in this book, 70-20-10 towards 100% performance, the role there is what we call the performance detective. You would ask consultative questions. So what is the organizational problem? What's the business problem? What's the people problem that we've got here? What are the problems? What are the issues we're trying to address? And what is it going to look like when it's finished? Because then we can start to look at the most appropriate solutions. And this is one of the major challenges that the training needs analysis process has put up for us over the last 50 years. My career has been spent fighting against a model whose output is almost inevitably training, when we know the training may be the solution in some cases, but in many cases it won't be the solution. And yet we continue. It's like the author Aldous Huxley once said, I see the best but I pursue it's the worst I pursue. We continue to do the same old thing, and then we're surprised that same person comes back to us a year later and says, well, actually I need another sales training program, please, because the other one hasn't had any impact, and therefore they expect the same thing again. And we know what they say about if we do the same stuff and expect different results, it's a sign of idiocy, of madness. So I think that there are a number of things that can be done simply, but getting that engagement and developing that capability, particularly around that consulting capability, is really critical.
Thank you. It's new now. We're officially supposed to end now, but if you have a bit more time, Charles, we still have most folks on. There's a couple more questions that have come in that I'd like to ask you. Is that all right?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So there's a question that came in from Ross that I'm very interested myself personally to hear. And Ross asks, how do you begin to integrate the 70-20-10 approach to the work on the job? Is there established methodologies for mapping to competency models?
That's a really good question, which I can't possibly address in any detail, in this time. I think there certainly is. In fact, again, I could show you when we were at Reuters, we mapped. Now, I give a health warning. I'll give a health warning after I tell you this. But at Reuters, we had, the standard Hay methodology come in and defined job families, job roles. There were 23 job families initially. There were hundreds of job roles in that, and within each job role there were general skills and then professional skills. We mapped all of those to, and there was a competency framework overlaying that. We mapped learning interventions, 70-20-10 learning interventions, to all of those job roles and each of those core capabilities, the competency framework and the professional and general skills. I would not recommend anyone ever do that. If you want a way to become old very quickly and be chasing your tail forever, you can try and do that, because as we know, new job roles are created and others disappear as mergers and acquisitions occur, and it's just a huge amount of work. It's a good way to get an insight into the sorts of support that can be provided in the 70 and 20 pieces for specific job roles. And certainly I've seen other organizations maybe take their scientists. I've worked with organizations where they have research scientists, and take the research scientists as a whole and look at appropriate ways in which they can support learning on the job. And in many ways it's through collaboration, it's through getting teams to work together, it's through sharing, narrating work, all those sorts of approaches. So there are a whole range of different ways that you can match it to your competency models and so on. However, my advice, Ross, would be go lightly. Don't try and build some, the problem with the HR mentality is we have to have a process for everything, and you need to make sure that those processes are really light. Otherwise, you get buried, and you find that your mapping never gets complete and maybe never gets even usable. So you really have to go lightly at it, I think.
Excellent, thank you. There's another question from Fiona Sakai, who asks, what new skills are needed by traditional learning professionals to achieve impact in the 70 and 20? The assumption is that the skills needed for the 10% are insufficient to achieve impact in the 70 and 20.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And in fact, this book that we published last year, that's now it's in English, it's in Dutch, it's in Korean, it's going to be available on Amazon very shortly. We've defined in great detail the roles, the tasks, the skill sets that are needed to support 70-20-10. And the first point I would say is that it's not always L&D that has these skills. I've mentioned one, the performance detective, in other words, performance consulting. Consulting skills are really critical. Other sorts of skills, for example, we've defined these 5 roles. They're all based around performance. There's a role called the performance master builder. Now, that's not just an instructional designer, because instructional design may be one little part of that. But if I'm an instructional designer, I need to build skills and capabilities beyond designing formal learning events. I need to be able to architect and structure, support approaches, resources, methodologies, all sorts of different things in order to help people do their jobs better. Because actually, as much as I've thought about it, the role of a learning and development professional ultimately is helping people do their jobs better. It's as simple as that. If I'm helping my people do their jobs better, I'm doing my work. You know, I'm getting my work done. If I'm not, I'm not. So I think that there are in each of these 5 roles, there's the detective, the performance detective, the architect, and again, a performance architect isn't, and many people think they're performance architects, but when we get into it and look at them, look at what they're doing, they're actually learning architects, they're not performance architects. The master builder, as I say, is building and constructing solutions in the workplace as well as structured. There's a role that we've called the game changer, which I don't know of any organization, L&D department, that has this role. And this is really a hybrid role of being both a program manager, but also a change agent. And I mentioned earlier on, this, in our most organizations, the people who have the expertise on this is marketing and corporate comms. And so, you know, L&D needs to be working with those people and using their expertise rather than trying to build that. And the last role is the performance tracker, who may be in the same body. That role might be in the same body as the performance detective, but that's being able to understand and define and track the right metrics. And again, it's not about learning metrics. It's about performance metrics. So very often it comes down to your stakeholder metrics. It comes down to how are we making sure that we're linking what we're doing through to customer satisfaction levels, sales levels. It could be some other metric that's used by stakeholders. So there's a whole range of different skills as well as tasks and workflows that learning and development needs to undertake in order to really implement 70-20-10 well.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Charles. So I'd like to thank Charles and thank everybody for giving us your time today to listen to Charles talk about 70-20-10. If you're interested in engaging further in learning from Charles around the 70-20-10, you will receive an email from the GoToWebinar system in about a day with a link to a handout on the 70-20-10 Institute, and there's a lot more resources certainly there for you to continue to learn from and engage with this. And of course, as you can see on the screen, Charles has published a Coaching Ourselves module on 70-20-10, and this is intended for a group of learning and development professionals to use on their own in their organization so that they can use the concepts of 70-20-10 and talk about what's going on in their organization and their experiences to do something with this and get started down this road of 70-20-10 and leveraging that. So please, again, you'll get a link to that as well about Coaching Ourselves, and you can follow up at any time. So thank you very much, Charles. It was a real pleasure as always.
Thank you very much, Phil. Yep.
And thank you very much, everybody. Have a good day, a good rest of the day, and a good week. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you all. Thank you all.